Hello, everyone. This is Brett, and welcome to the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord. Today, we have John Vervaeke back for another Q&A. Thanks, John, for being here.
Thank you, and thank you for being so flexible about last week. This has been an extremely busy time for me, it's not really letting up. I was at UTism. I've published an online essay. I'm doing an online interview. I'm doing a whole bunch of two video series, and I'm planning to go to the UK in a couple weeks. So, it's so I really appreciate the flexibility.
Great, and thanks. And Andre, our co-admin, is here to help me moderate and to alternate questions. Thanks for being here, Andre.
Good to be here. It's good to hear your voice again, John. I hope things have been well over there.
They are. It's good to hear your voice too, Andre.
So let's get started into the questions. The milkman asks, how can sacredness be understood within the context of the religion of no religion? And how does it relate to the sacred? Can you give any examples to help understand it?
Yeah, so I think the sacred is any way in which we're using story, symbol, myth, basically the imaginal, and that's something I've done a lot of work on recently. The papers I published in my discussion at UTism, and you'll see that showing up in my more recent work. It's the talk I'm going to give at Cambridge is going to center around this. But anyways, um, when we're doing that for the sake of religio itself. We of course tell stories and invoke symbols for all kinds of things, but we direct it towards a religio itself. That's what I consider sacredness. And then it has a functional. That's its structural description, and its functional description is the sacred is the use of mythos in the way I've just described to celebrate religio in order to do two functions: homos against absurdity and horror, but also propel us into confronting the numinous. And in that sense, it's a higher order way, a sort of a higher order form relevance realization, because homing is how we can assimilate information, and the numinous is when we are forced to accommodate information, new information, challenging information, complex information, undergoing a process of growth, self-transcendence, etc. So any community that ritualistically, and I mean that in a positive sense, makes use of the elements of mythos in order to enhance people's sense of connectedness to themselves, to each other, and the world in a way that gives them a sense of being at home in the cosmos, but also encourages them in the strong sense of the virtue of courage, them to confront the numinous, is, I think, a sacred act, a sacred activity, a sacred practice. And it's I see no reason why the religion that's not a religion couldn't have many of these practices. For example, when I undertake the combination of meditation and contemplation, it's designed to exactly do that. It's designed to give me a deep sense of stability and centeredness and homing me into the depths of reality, while also exposing me to mystery and challenge, and things that could potential and and non-egoic states and trans-egoic states that could potentially be horrifying, but helping to render them at least numinous and numinous enough that I can accommodate towards them in a non-terrifying manner. So I think any set of practices that are properly coordinated to home us, and like in opponent processing, to home us and to take us from home. Think of Luke Skywalker. Um, I'm making use of the elements of mythos to do that in an imaginal way. I think that's the sacred.
Great.
Go ahead.
Audrey, do you want to do the next question?
Yeah, this question is from James. It says, I have a question about ecology of practice and its use outside of the original ecosystem. Is it possible that a lack of commitment to one ecosystem has a negative effect on the benefits you can derive? In different words, is it better that I uh, keep to one connected ecology of practices instead of cherry picking from different cultures at random?
So I mean, it's hard to give like a straight yes or no answer to that. The problem with cherry picking is it's very liable to be driven by individual bias and by egocentric concerns that won't properly challenge the ego. Um, that's one of the benefit of like a traditional or established ecology of practices. The problem the established ecology of practices is that it's often not well fitted to a particular individual and their idiosyncratic development, history, position in the community, etc. Um, so I guess I would have to ask you, which of these two concerns do you feel is most prominent right now? It sounds like the first concern is more prominent for you. That you're afraid, again, justifiably so, that being a dilettante, a cherry picker, will not actually lead to an ecology of practices that is um, challenging you to break outside of your bias and your egocentrism. So the recommendation I usually give to people is to try and strike a balance between, right, something that is established and you find comfortable, and introducing, this is the zone of proximal development, introducing novelty into it enough so that you feel that it is, what do I want to say here? You feel that it's reinvigorating the traditional, but you also should choose, you should commit to the traditional even in the aspects that don't make you that make you uncomfortable, precisely because that resistance might be a place in which you're actually rubbing against some bias and some egocentrism. So you sort of have to get that balance where there's enough of your participation in the creation of your ecology of practices that you feel it is tailored to you, but you don't want it to be tailored so much that it's comfortable, and you should emphasize those aspects of a traditional ecology of practice that you may have some initial resistance to, and I don't mean for moral reasons because that's a different considerations. If there's some aspect, which you're being exploited or manipulated or deceived or harmed, then of course just drop that. I'm not talking about any of that. But the degree to which a standard ecology of practices that is already established is enough outside of your egocentric construction so that it can challenge you. This is a delicate balancing act. I wish I could give you, like, here's the 1-2 recipe for this. But you're trying to balance between, like I said, you're trying to balance between it fitting you, being tailored to you so that it reaches you, it arouses you, it inspires you, but also it being generated by people other than you, so that there's a real chance it will challenge you and move you beyond bias and egocentrism. So that's a very tricky thing to do, and I found that very tricky in my own life. I've tried to stick with practices, especially when there's a part of me that's just saying this is boring. You don't need to do this practice. And generally, I'll take that as an indication that I should keep going with it, because it's triggering resistance. But if it's going on for quite a while, the practice is becoming very dry and not producing anything, then I do a second thought and think, well, there's also a real possibility that it doesn't suit me, not in the sense of suit my bias or my egocentrism, but maybe it doesn't fit me well, where I am in my life right now, or the kinds of problems I'm facing right now, or something like that. So we're caught between two opposing, of course, isn't this always the case? We're caught between two opposing goals, and what we're trying to do is to move, you know, dynamically between them, have them counterbalance each other, opponent processing, so that we can avoid both of those errors, I suppose is the way to put it, where the traditional isn't really reaching us because maybe it's got so many things that are irrelevant to our lives and the world we're living in. And the self-generated, corrected, created, completely novel, self-created, completely novel ecology of practices that can beset us by just merely reinforcing our bias and our egocentrism. So it's a very important question. I wish I could give you a simple recipe for how to address it. Unfortunately, like many things where we're talking about genuine transformation and education, it involves learning the finesse of how to trade between these opponent processes.
All right. Thank you. Emphasis. I've sent you an invite. Okay, great. You have a question for John.
Yeah. Hi, John. I'm Spencer.
Hello.
I'm a grad student in education. And I wanted to ask if you've had much exposure to Gilles Deleuze, because whenever I've heard you talk about Merleau-Ponty, and whenever I've talked to people about Merleau-Ponty, I felt a lot of resonance. And actually, Judith Wambach a couple years ago wrote a book called Thinking Between Deleuze and Merleau-Ponty, where she argued that they kind of had a very similar philosophical project.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I am well. First of all, I'm guilty of the academic sin of owning a book and confusing that with having read it. But Jordan Hall has recommended Deleuze to me, and the book I'm starting Deleuze on is Deleuze's book on Spinoza. But it's unfortunately, I've read a bunch of books on Spinoza, and that's still a couple books down in my Spinoza pile. So I will get to Deleuze, and I've been told that, in fact, it was recommended to me by Jordan that the best connection for me was first via Spinoza, so that's where I'm going, and then hopefully I'll be able to make connections, like you said, to Merleau-Ponty and other things. So I know of Deleuze. I have committed myself to reading the book by Deleuze on Spinoza, but I'm not there yet. So I'm still mostly ignorant.
That's completely fair. And yeah, I think I agree with him. That sounds smart.
Good, thank you. That will encourage me to keep going. Like I read a bunch of books, and then and the most recent one was Carlyle's Spinoza's Religion, which I highly recommend. And I've had to leave Spinoza aside for a bit to pick up on. Well, I've been reading a lot more Merleau-Ponty, and also reading a bunch of other books around related ideas about the phenomenology and the ontology of intelligibility. And of course, I've got the next book on Spinoza is directly on that topic. I've started it, but I'm only a few pages in because it wrestles with Spinoza's invocation of the principle of sufficient reason and what's that saying about the relationship between intelligibility and reality. So that's sort of where I am right now.
All right, cool. I'm glad to hear that.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. LOK asks, is the journey more important than the destination? Is the having of the destination more important than the becoming of the journey?
Depends. I mean, it depends if you are engaged, which mode you're in. Are you in the telic mode or the paratelic mode? And each mode has its appropriateness, as do the being modes and the having mode.
And just for our audience, could you just briefly explain telic and paratelic?
Oh, sure. This is from Michael Apter's work on the metamotivational theory. And so it's called reversal theory. The idea is we can interpret the same level of metabolic arousal in two different frames. So when I'm in the telic frame, the activity I'm doing is not for its own sake. The activity is instrumental for achieving a goal that is inherently valuable to me. And when I'm in the telic mode, high arousal usually means I'm still not at my goal, and therefore high arousal, it becomes frustrating and eventually anxiety producing. Low arousal can mean one of two things. It can mean I've given up, and then that sort of spirals you off into depression. Or more frequently, what it means is I've achieved my goal, and therefore I'm not exerting all the metabolic effort to get there. And that is experienced pleasantly as relaxation, contentment, a sense of having, achieved something. When I'm in the paratelic mode, I reverse the valuation. Now I'm engaged in activity for its own sake, and the point of the goals is to just give me a structure within which I can engage in the activity for its own sake. And that in the paratelic mode, high arousal means I'm engaging a lot in the intrinsically interesting, inherently valuable process, and so that's experienced as excitement. And low arousal is experienced as boredom. A good quick test to see if you're in the telic mode, if an activity is telic for you or paratelic, is to ask yourself if you would welcome a shortcut. For me, brushing my teeth is completely telic. Do not find the activity at all interesting, pleasurable, rewarding. I don't want to get into the flow state or anything like that. So if you came to me and you said, here's a way you can get clean teeth without brushing your teeth and it only takes 1 second, I'd take it like that. You come to me and you said, you know what? Here's a way of avoiding all of that interaction with the person you're making love to, and yet in 1 second, just getting to the climax. Do you want that? And I'm going to say, no, I don't want that. That's the end of the activity, but that's not the value of the activity. And of course, you can often tell how good your lover is about whether or not they can properly enter into the paratelic mode when making love. So if you're in the paratelic mode, it's all about the journey. It's all about the process. It's not about the destination. The destination is just there for the sake of the journey. When you're in the telic mode, it's the exact opposite. The journey is there for the sake of the destination. And if a shortcut is available, you would take it. And therefore, there are situations, and I do think those probably map on the being and the having modes. That's a longer argument. And I do think, just like the being and the having modes, it depends on the goal. It depends on, therefore, the task. If there's a goal to which the telic mode is appropriate, the destination matters, and the journey is just in service of that. If it's an activity that to which the paratelic mode is appropriate, then it is indeed the journey that matters and not the destination. You can compare this with like how two people could play tennis. A person could be playing tennis in the paratelic mode and finishing the game while that's the goal. It's not something they welcome. They want to enjoy tennis, and in that sense, the journey is important. If somebody's playing it to win money, then of course, right? Destination is what matters and not the journey. Now, if you're asking me, is one absolutely better than the other in some grand way, in which people sometimes say it's always about the journey, never about the destination, I would say that's simply false. And I think that's a case of a kind of modal confusion, a metamodal, because this is metamotivational states confusion, and we should avoid that kind of simplicity in our thinking. For me, for example, getting through the pandemic, if we can find a shortcut, do it. Do it. Do it right now, because getting people healthy and back to their lives is inherently valuable. There's nothing about the journey of this that I find that valuable. The journey is for the sake of getting to the goal. But if you're asking when I'm in the middle of dialogos, do I want a shortcut to the end of the practice? Not at all. So I think we should avoid sort of sloganistic things about this. I think we should adopt what Apter does, which is to see that, and this is actually his way of talking about it, there's an opponent processing between these two modes, and only in an optimal grip between them do we actually live as well as we can.
Okay. Lesius asks, I want to arm my kids against perennial problems as soon and as much as possible. Any thoughts on that? Thanks in advance.
You have to be really careful, but yeah. So Aristotle's point, I think, about this is the best. Um, the best thing to do with children, and this is easily said, but hard to do, is think about the habits you can inculcate in them that will act as platforms or virtues that you want to educate in them. So, right, you want to cultivate at least the cardinal virtues because they really help uh, prepare people to have the depth and the breadth and the empowerment of mind to wrestle with the perennial problems. So, habits that lead to virtues. You want some of those important virtues to be virtues of reflection, of wonder, of pondering, so that your children are capable of internalizing ecologies of practices as they move into adolescence and adulthood. I know we would all like to do it sort of as soon as possible, but we do have to pay due respect and even reverence um, to the developmental stage that children are at. You wouldn't wouldn't say, well, you know what we should do is we should get the 6-year-old to be reading Heidegger. I don't think that's a good thing to do. But you might get the child first of all into the habit of just reading, taking time away from the screen and reading, and maybe talking with them and reflecting about what they're reading, and then start to build up the virtue of sort of reflective rationality. What's the best interpretation about what you've read? What makes it the best interpretation? And then on the basis of reflective rationality, start to get them to start to consider the importance of self-correction, the possibilities of self-deception, and then start to introduce them to practices, an ecology of practices, or addressing the perennial problems of absurdity and alienation, anxiety, etc. So I think this is an example where the Platonic Aristotelian pedagogical program is still the best that I can see. Habits into virtues, right? And you usually should start with sort of the more moral virtues and then move into the intellectual virtues, and from the intellectual virtues into beginnings of reflective rationality and wisdom, and doing that in combination with the progressive awareness of the need for self-correction and self-transcendence. And that takes you into them wanting to pursue and inculcate and inculcate in themselves, internalize the ecology of practices for addressing the perennial problems. I think it's a very good idea. Also educate them as much as you can in the history of the sort of more historical factors that exacerbate the perennial problems in our culture, the way social media is making things worse also, etc. Speaking as a parent myself, like I can do that now. I'm moving into that stage of the ecology of practices and the higher order reflection with my older son, Jason. With my younger son, he's only 17. It's much more me trying to find where he is motivated and to try and get him into just initial habits of interaction and reflection. And that's what I'm doing with him now. I'm trying to build the initial, cultivate, I've been cultivating the habits, but that point where you're starting to, his mom has been doing a lot too. I don't want to take sole credit. That would be really false of me. But turning that to, I got to talk to him tonight about, okay, son, you're really passionate about music production and sound engineering. But you've got to stick. That means you're going to go to post-secondary education. You got to really get good at inculcating the habit of punctuality and getting to school every day, totally on time, and that habit. And he's getting it. He's getting it. That habit then is a platform upon which he can cultivate a virtue, and then that virtue will put him in touch with a very complex environment, and he can start to develop the skills that he needs. And then all of that, right, is still, a few years away from me sort of directly turning him towards perennial problems. Of course, I've talked with him and helped with him along the way with issues around depression and anxiety, which are often beset kids when they're in adolescence. But it's been my experience that you have to be really careful about the timing of this, and that habits to virtues, rationality to wisdom, to the ecology of practices for addressing um, problems. I can't really recommend anything better than that I can think of.
Thank you. And to those who are watching right now on YouTube or recording on YouTube, please give this video a like. And there is a link to our Discord, an invite link to the Discord. So if you're listening to this, you're probably interested in the types of conversations and activities we have here. So please stop by. So Ryan writes, "Hey John, you and the work you have done with others are astonishing. Whenever I'm watching a video with you and your friends, I struggle to understand what is being discussed at first, but somewhere along the way, something important clicks, and all of a sudden, what I'm hearing makes sense in a way that affords a reframe of my worldview. I believe that I'm experiencing something like aporia in those moments. You and your expanding circle have brought and are bringing something beautiful into this world. Good luck, John. My question is, have you any thoughts on the work done by Jack Panksepp and or Mark Solms on the seven instincts and the consciousness id? If so, is there a place in your framework where they figure in? Anything you can relate about your approach to communicating with and coming into proper relationship with the personal and conscious would be greatly appreciated. For example, why is it crucial that we relate to our own personal unconscious?"
Wow. So first of all, thank you for saying that, and I agree that yeah, aporia is definitely something we do in many of the videos, especially the CogSci shows. You'll see that we'll begin with problematizing something, really problematizing it, getting people into aporia, and then yeah, trying to get the dialogos to get the gestalt to form the way you described. So I'm glad you're experiencing it that way. That was the intent.
I'm sorry, for our audience, what is aporia?
Aporia is it's in Socrates, where Socrates is questioning you, causing you to come to a state of wonderment, where you realize you don't understand, you don't know what you thought you know, and that you are really opened to a new understanding, to insight, to transformation. That's what aporia is.
Right.
Oh, in answer to the question about the personal unconscious, first of all, Panksepp, I do not know that work very well. The person to talk to about that is Greg Enriquez. He's incorporated a lot of that into his model, and I work with Greg. So I don't want to comment on something for which I don't have the relevant expertise or knowledge. I could point you to Greg. He'd be glad to talk to any of you, because his work and mine that's why we're frequently partners. We're working on a new series with Gary Hovhannissian, by the way, on psyche pathology. There's a reason why we're calling it psyche pathology rather than psychopathology, and well-being. And there's a reason I keep working with Greg is precisely because he knows a lot of things about a lot of things that I do not. Not a lot, but we have tremendous points of convergence, which really makes for very fecund interaction. And we get into some like genuine moments of dialogos where together we spark or create something that neither one of us had individually come up with. So I would recommend that. The last point about the personal unconscious. again, I'm somewhat limited in my understanding of how people use that term. Though, I mean, the familiarity I have with that is from Jung. I've studied Jung in both senses. I've read the material, gone to workshops, gone to courses, also went through Jungian therapy. So that's why is it important to wrestle with the personal unconscious? I mean, Jungians tend to often emphasize the collective unconscious and be dismissive of Freud, because Freud was only dealing with the personal unconscious. I'm not so clear about this distinction as it actually shows up in the phenomenology of my experience, like in my dreams, or when I'm doing poetry or other artistic or creative endeavors. I'm not quite so clear about the line. I mean, because the idea is the personal unconscious is supposed to be things that are sort of idiosyncratic to me, where the collective unconscious is supposed to be sort of universal features. But I mean, and Jung is the Plato of the psyche, and this is the issue of participation. Example, even within the collective unconscious, the particular way it shows up in your psyche is colored by your personal unconscious. Presumably, there's nothing in your experience that's absolutely idiosyncratic to you and is not importantly shared with other people across culture and time and context. So, I think of it more not as I don't think of it as clear structural difference, more as just different poles on a continuum in which we are wrestling with sort of unsuccessful framings of problems. So my way of trying to get convergence between Jung and current cog sci is to center on the idea of complementarity, that the point of unconscious material is it's compensatory, or it complements. Compensatory is, in fact, maybe even a better term. I think, in fact, that's his preferred term, so I think I might have misspoken. The idea that the point of unconscious material is to compensate for narrowness or brittleness within your conscious framing of things. Problem again with that is, does it have to come from the deep unconscious? We all mind wander for just that reason. Mind wander to take us enough away from our current framing and mild distraction is actually what you want, so that we will come back and reframe things. And wandering is functional. It helps to afford insight, but you don't want to do it too much. You don't want to do it too little. Again, we keep coming back to this theme tonight. So what Cogsci says is this unconscious material can definitely have that effect of bumping you out of framing that needs to be altered, and you're incapable of doing it sort of by staying within the frame. I think that idea of Jung is plausibly convergent with a lot of Cogsci about incubation, about insight, about dumping noise into the system to prevent overfitting the data. So that's a part of Jung that I think gives an answer to your question, which is, why do you want to work with unconscious material? Because it helps you break frame, make connections that you don't typically make, so that you can make an alternative frame in a new way. And that is often what we need, a kind of moderate distraction. I don't want a psychotic break. I want a moderate distraction from our framing that will feel weird, bizarre, even sometimes a little uncanny, even sometimes a little creepy, even sometimes numinous. But if it's getting to the point of like horror on a regular basis, then I think some significant therapy needs to be done. But generally, when we can work with it on our own, it helps with that compensatory function of snapping us out of ways in which we might get locked into framing by the habits of our conscious experience.
Clark asks, do you think humans can glimpse or grasp the infinite?
I think humans can get a trajectory sense of the infinite. And this is very much a Neoplatonic idea. Glimpse of the sun in Plato's Republic is interpreted later, especially by the Eastern Christian Neoplatonist Gregory of Nyssa, and I have to see if Maximus picks that up, but I think he does. Of we get a sense of the infinity of God because God can continually afford our own self-transcendence. This is the epictasis notion of the beatific vision, which is we never see God, but we come to see more and more the way God sees. And this is definitely Nicholas of Cusa. And we get a sense of the inexhaustibleness of that affordance, and that is the sense we can have of the infinite. It's in that sense a trajectory sense of the infinite as opposed to any cognitive closure around it. So that's been that's, I mean, even when you're just counting numbers, you can't count to infinity, but you realize that the number, the counting function is inexhaustible, and you get a sense of the infinite by the capacity to inexhaustibly go to the next number. Even in more important cases, right, where, and I really don't quite know what that means, right? I don't know what it would mean to forever be engaging in self-transcendence. I guess the idea is within our lifetime, of course, we can get a sense that self-transcendence is always available to us because if we're in right relationship with the depths of reality, because of an inexhaustible affordance that there's nothing we can do to drain it dry. And this is very much the Taoist notion of the Tao too. The Tao is like a well that is never used up. You can't actually swim to the depths of the well, but you know that there is no bottom to it because you can never use it up. That's how I think we get proper sense. And this is Schlegel's idea that we are finite. We're the finite that is always longing for the infinite, but we're only aware of how we're finite in a moment in which we transcend a limit. But of course, there are always ways in which we're limited, and there's a possibility of self-transcendence. So are we the kind of beings like Gregory of Nyssa proposes? Some of the Christian tradition proposes that could perpetually, ever and ever, self-transcend? I don't know. And this is where I often quote Herman Melville in Moby Dick. What is man that he should live out the lifetime of his God? Are we really beings capable of that? I was just watching Interstellar again. There's two movies in there, and I wish they'd made them separate movies. I mean, I like the movie. It's a good movie. A big part of that movie is making us realize that we really aren't capable of space. It is so incomparably larger than we understand. Like just the relativistic effects of moving on a planet that's near a black hole and all that. And I thought that was a wonderful theme. They of course then said no, but eventually human beings become gods. And I understand why that was dramatically important. I'm not so sure that that's metaphysically plausible. Uh, I'm not sure that I agree with Gregory of Nyssa's ultimate proposal that we can do this forever. I do get the sense that there's something about reality that could sustain it forever. So, my best answer, I think.
Mark 12 asks, do you agree with Merleau-Ponty's description of space in the Phenomenology of Perception, if you have read it?
I have read it. I read it a long time ago, and unfortunately, I'm really worried about reconstructive memory. as I'm working on right now. We just finished, Dan Chappie and I. We finished Lowe's book, where he's arguing, he's attempting to complete the argument from The Invisible and the Invisible, which was Merleau-Ponty's last works, and he actually died before completing it. That and Sign. So I'm at the other end trying to understand Merleau-Ponty. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I like the idea of the essence of the body being central. The body allows us to be, it's a body amongst other bodies in the world, but it's also our body. So it's simultaneously specific to us, but also is just part of the general case of things being embodied. And that the body inherently is a thing beyond itself. It's an openness to the world, and that space is in some sense. I got to be really careful. The phenomenology of space is at least constituted by that embodied openness. Uh, Whether or not, see, and I'm also getting um, memory interference from Harman's work on object-oriented ontology, where they think of space as actually emerging out of that kind of property objects, that objects are always a thing beyond themselves. Um, so this is going to be sort of a meta answer. I'm probably in agreement with it, but I don't know if I'm remembering it accurately because of the reading I'm doing on the very end of Merleau-Ponty and the relationship between the visible and the invisible, and the relationship between perceptual logos, spoken logos, and conceptual logos. That's where I'm doing a lot of work right now. So I think, yeah, and there's a sense in which space is something that we can only participate in precisely because we are embodied beings. That a purely abstract representation of space is actually not finally meaningful to us. So, I'm sorry, that wasn't a very cogent answer, like a yes or no answer, and it's because, paradoxically or ironically, it's because I'm so interested in diving so deep into later Merleau-Ponty that I'm afraid I will be misremembering the account in um, phenomenology of perception. I mean, I Toad stuff about um, our embodiment in figuring how we see space, I think, which was deeply influenced by Merleau-Ponty, is very right. Like in Body and World, he talks about, if your epistemology takes the passive spectator viewpoint as Hume's does, sorry, then you won't be able to see causation. You won't be able to actually see space. But if you're moving around and interacting in an embodied fashion, Merleau-Ponty talks about, then of course space becomes a continuum for you, as does causation, and then causation and time and space are bound up together in powerful ways. I hope this was at least a helpful answer. But like I said, read the phenomenology of perception in grad school, and then I've been reading about all of the ramifications for this over my career as a 4E cognitive scientist, and I've only directly returned the Merleau-Ponty text very recently, but very helpfully. But like I said, it's from work at the end of his career, because that's most consonant with the problems I'm wrestling with right now.
Grim Grizz.
I, I, I
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
was going to say I reread the preface recently in order to prepare for the low reading. I should reread the entire book again. It's a masterpiece. It's up there with Religion and Nothingness for me.
Grim Grizz would like to ask you if you would mind riffing about reverence for a couple minutes.
Yeah. Sure. So I think reverence is a species of relevance, and it's the kind of connectedness to something that we experience as, well, metaphorically, as larger, where that's taken to mean that it has a reality and value, a reality independent of our conception of it, and it's like, so it's not just it doesn't exist just in via our thought. It has a proper independence and autonomy. It can even make demands on us or pose challenges to us. It has a value independent of our egocentric preferences. Um, so reverence is to feel connected to that kind of being, that kind of a being, um, and so me, reverence is that aspect of relevance realization that is calling us most towards that meta desire that Plato talks about of being in contact with what's real, where that's a conformity that continually demands transformation from us in order to disclose the depths of a reality that is not bound to us and to our egocentrism. And then, in that sense, reverence is in contrast to a kind to another important kind of experience, which is that experience of inner peace, in which we feel that we are most integrated and held together with integrity, where we have minimal cognitive dissonance. Now, what can happen? Some of the most profound experiences of our life, and have both of those co-occur. And this, of course, was Plato's proposal. You can experience profound reverence for the good, the true, the beautiful. And sometimes that's shocking, it's distressing. Plotinus talks about how beauty can be so distressing to us because the reverence is demanding from us, it's challenging us. Sometimes, right, we have that sense of being connected to something much greater than us. Um, well, at the same time, that is resonating with a sense of being drawn together, integrated, um, being at peace. Um, and I think those are the most profound moments of reverence. Um, so I think to use some examples that are like, I've had moments of reverence in the middle of a lightning storm, which I have that sense of reverence that is bordering on awe. But I wasn't peaceful. I wasn't content. There was a definite sense of an ominous aspect to it. I've also had a moment of reverence when I've been contemplating the ocean, and it's a beautiful, clear blue day, and I get a sense of the vastness of the ocean. I'm not in the ocean. I'm not threatened by it. Perhaps on the shore. And this is the prospect and refuge theory. So, not I myself am experiencing a kind of contentedness and being at peace, while also being open to and connected to aspects of reality that are beyond me, and challenge me to move outside the prison of my own ego. So I think Woodruff is right. I think reverence is most properly, ultimately, a virtue. Then um, and it's the virtue that to attunes us to what is generates awe, what can generate awe and wonder. It's not like the experience of horror because it's still it's potentially connectable to a sense of being at peace and being feeling integrated, feeling at one with oneself. So the feeling at one with something beyond oneself is resonating with feeling being at one within the depths of oneself. And you know, Kant famously talked about that. The two things that filled him with unending awe were the starry heavens above and the moral law within. The depths. So when he was at peace within sort of his moral conscience, and he was also capable of contemplating the infinite spaces that so terrified Pascal. Yeah, I think Woodruff is right that reverence is the virtue that properly attunes us so we can be open to being connected with that is beyond us and calls us beyond to the transcendental dimensions, the true, the good, and the beautiful, in a way that doesn't tear us, uproot us, our capacity to find peace. So that would be my riff on reverence.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. John has a hard out at 7:30, and Andre had to step away, but he's back. So Andre, please read a potentially last question from Fanny. If we have time, we can fit in one more after that.
I'm finally back. I just got off a 40-minute phone call, which pointed me away from religio and more towards distressio, I think. So Fanny asks, you reject nominalism, in brackets, all patterns are in the mind, yet you agree with Goodman's similarity argument that things can only appear similar to an observer. If two things are the same real pattern, in brackets, example, two sucrose molecules, are they not more similar than two things that aren't the same real pattern, in brackets, a sucrose molecule and a car?
Okay, so that's a very good question, and there's 2 points to that. One is I actually make a distinction between two kinds of similarity, which is not exactly what Goodman does, but it's based on Goodman, and I think it's proper to give him credit for inspiring it. This is between logical similarity and psychological similarity. It's true that things have this indefinite capacity to be similar to each other logically because they share. It is true that the plum and the lawnmower both share the fact that neither one existed 300 million years ago. It is true. Notice what I'm saying. It's not a false relation. It is true that they share those properties. It's true that neither one of them is a particularly good weapon. Point is, we don't actually use that full-blown right logical similarity because it's combinatorially explosive. We pick a subset, and subset is only pragmatically driven. We choose the subset and make it special because of its relevance to us. This goes to a point that I want to make, and right, we use things other than our psychological uh, processes of relevance. I got to be really careful here. Let me start this again. Other than relying on just pragmatic use, we have another way in which we sift through all the logical similarities to determine what we call essential similarities. These are the essence, and I agree with Quine. That's what the scientific method does. In between full-blown logical similarity in which everything is similar to everything else, and that kind of pushes you towards, the Neoplatonic notion of God's intellect, for example, and the constrained everyday obviousness of our psychological categories like chairs and games. There's this intermediate where we select logical categories. Sorry, we select from all the logical possible similarities, ones that are not just psychologically useful, but ones that we have good evidence and reason believe actually track the causal processes of the universe. And namely, so what science does is science tells us which of our categories are categories that have an essence, which is they support universal generalizations, they support inference, they support science. agree with a lot of sort of current Platonists that science requires that. Science requires that there really are essential properties. There really are shared properties that point to the causal unfoldment of the universe. I think that's what science does. I think E equals mc squared describes something real about reality. And so, in fact, one of the ways of thinking about science is that it tries to steer between all the merely logically true similarities, all the merely psychologically pertinent similarities, the ones that actually help us distinguish relations, causation. In that sense, science is non-nominalist. It's trying to get between those two things. And I think it's right to say, for example, that light and electricity and magnetism all have an essential similarity to them, such that we can make law-like predictions. The point when I've talked about this with categorization is that our cognitive categorization machinery is not that good. We pick out similarities for reasons having to do with how they are relevant to us in our particular projects. Though, and that relevance does not always map onto what is relevant to explaining the real ontological structure of the universe. This is what I mean by saying I want to advocate for a post-nominalist Neoplatonism. The problem with Neoplatonism, the ancient version, is it didn't have a clear, clean way of deciding between the patterns that are merely projected, those that are real in a logical sense of being real correlations but are not causal, and those that are causal. And I think, therefore, that we need, and nominalism provoked us into making those distinctions in response to it. Science is not nominalistic. It can't be. So I think a post-nominalist Neoplatonism is one that learns as much as it can from science, science in general and cognitive science in specific, learns from it how to most reliably and rationally distinguish between the merely projected patterns, merely the merely correlational, they're logically true, but they don't carry any causal oomph, and the causal patterns. And then more deeply underneath the causal patterns, the ultimate structural patterns, the universal constraints, like E equals mc squared, force equals mass times acceleration, etc. So that's a really good question. What I'm trying to convey to is I take the question seriously, and that is what I mean by proposing a post-nominalist Platonism. We should remember that Platonism was influential, Neoplatonism especially, at the end of the late Renaissance and helping to promote scientific revolution. It was very influential at the beginning of the 20th century with the Einsteinian and quantum revolutions. Many of the important thinkers were influenced by Neoplatonism or things relevantly similar to Neoplatonism. So Neoplatonism can properly enter into reciprocal reconstruction with science. That's one of its great recommendations. I don't think we should pursue a Neoplatonism that is pre-scientific, precisely because it hasn't wrestled with the challenge of nominalism to properly and reliably and rationally distinguish between merely projected patterns, merely correlational patterns, causal patterns, structural patterns. That's my answer.
I want to thank you, John. I know how valuable your time is, and we so very much appreciate how much of it you give to us. That was fantastic as usual. And thank you to Andre for helping me with the questions, and our wonderful members. You're who make this happen. I posted a link to our Google Calendar and our YouTube page, and that'll also be in the show notes in the YouTube channel. And so I want to encourage people to check out the other events. We have other events that will be coming, and right after this, right now, we'll be having a discussion in the Grove on art and art as a psychotechnology, led by Rachel Hayden and Alexandra Zachary. So please join us there. So thank you all so much.
Thanks,
Care,
John.
everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.